My dear friends, welcome to the Daily Planet channel. I'm Dmitry Zolotarev. I'm the editor and the host of this show, which I think I'm gonna name the Periscope Depth. I have a very special friend today, which is one of the most respected among English so-called rebel audience, which, well, this is not my term, this is term of Clayton Morris, and one of the most respected experts and most loved in Russia. Saying most respected and most loved, I mean every word. U.S. Marine Corps Major Scott Ritter, welcome to the show. I'm very excited and very grateful to you. You might find the time and join me today. Thank you so much.
It's my honor, and privilege, and pleasure. Thank you for inviting me, and I look forward to our conversation.
It's impossible to overestimate the meaning of what you do for the Russians. You know, you should go read in the comments on your interviews, which are translated in Russian, where people say, Scott Ritter for the President of the United States. Give Scott Ritter the Russian citizenship. And a lot of words of love. And that's because you give people hope. A lot of people don't know sometimes how to take some events which taken place in the world and in Ukraine right now. And sometimes they can't find what they seek for on the Russian mainstream. So they go to you. They starting looking to you, and they say that your answers, your analysis is just like a therapy. After that, they really have hope, they are in comfort, and they know what to expect and how to take this certain event, let's say. And whether it is bombardment of Russian barracks or something, anything which is not clear, you make it very clear. And you really give hope, not because you want it to look so, because you just take it, analyze it, and say as it is. Okay.
Let me respond to that. Wow. That is. It's a great honor that people feel that way. It's also a huge burden. That you just put on me. I would not be the right person to be president of the United States. It requires a different caliber of person, and if I were that caliber, you wouldn't be talking to me right now, because I'd be saying completely different things about the situation in Russia, because I'd be politically motivated, designed to say things that please the establishment, not reflect an accurate assessment. Two, thank you very much for people who say I should be offered Russian citizenship. I'm an American. I'm a proud American. I love my country. One of the reasons why I speak out like this is because I think it's the duty and obligation of every American citizen to speak truth to power. And I'm in firm disagreement with the policies of my government, but my government is not my country.
Absolutely.
And one of the reasons why I think one of the things that gives me credibility, hopefully, to the Russian people is that I'm not trying to say things so that they please the Russian people.
Exactly.
I'm saying what I feel is the answer. Because if I were just saying things that I thought would please the Russian people, that would be worthless. That would be meaningless. It would be shallow. I'm saying things, I have to be honest, when I first started doing this, I didn't realize I was addressing so many Russian people. I didn't realize that my words were being translated into Russian broadcast. I wasn't intending to have a Russian audience. But once it became clear that I did have a Russian audience, I think the other important thing, and why it's critical that I be seen as an American, is that one of the things that I like to talk about is that we have to look beyond this conflict. I know that's difficult to do. Because this is of immediate concern and of deep personal concern to everybody in Russia. Your loved ones are at war. And people you care about are at war on both sides of the conflict. I mean, this is a horrible situation that Russia's been put into, by and large, by the policies of my government. But at some point in time, we can't allow the rancor, the anger, the angst that is rightfully generated by this situation. Russians have every right to be unfriendly to the United States and, frankly speaking, to the American people. You have every right. You have every right.
So we are not unfriendly to the American people. I'm really sorry to interrupt you.
No, I didn't say you were.
Yeah.
I said you have every right to be. You have every right to be.
Sorry.
But you're not. And I hope that by speaking to the Russian people in an honest manner, that they can see that someday this conflict, when it ends, there is a necessity for our two peoples to get back on track. Friendly relations, the peoples. Governments are governments.
Absolutely, yeah.
They will do what they do. But it's essential that the people of the United States and the people of Russia find a way to, if we can't be friends, and I'd like to believe we can because we once were friends.
Yeah.
I have always been friends with the Russian people. But if we can't be, I understand that there's some difficulties. We can at least be friendly. We can live in peaceful coexistence. We don't have to be enemies. And that's why it's essential, I think, to come on programs like yours and speak to the Russian people, because I hope look, I'm not perfect. I'm not the world's greatest analyst. I speak honestly, but I can make mistakes. And I hope people understand that I don't have a crystal ball and I can say things that I believe are correct and they won't turn out to be correct because I wasn't aware of all the information. And even if I was aware of all the information, I'm God. And, I can make errors in judgment. But any errors in judgment I make aren't malicious. They're honest errors, etc. So I hope people aren't looking at me as some sort of a savant that is giving all the answers, but rather look at me as part of a process of thinking through a problem logically, responsibly, and in a manner which reflects humanity and the defense of humanity, whether it be Russian, Ukrainian, American, European. I mean, we're all humans on this planet together. We have to learn to find a way to live together, or else
absolutely,
Mother Nature may answer that question for us and remove us from the equation because we are no longer worthy of existing on this wonderful planet we call Earth.
Absolutely.
I just want to throw that in there because it's a huge burden to be thought of so highly, because that's a lot of responsibility that gets put on my shoulders. And I just want people to know that I respect that and I will do my best, but I'm just one man who is trying to do the right thing, and people need to keep that in perspective when they listen to
one man, but not the only. You're not the only, and that is great. Which all you just said, I absolutely agree. And I do remember when the Soviet Union collapsed, I was finishing high school, and everyone was just excited that we are not longer the opponents. We are not longer, we are friends. Everybody thought that United States and the Soviet Union can be friends, and all of the people around me were very open. No one knew that. Some presidents and no one thought of the governments that they sometimes do not belong to themselves. They are manipulated. And I do understand that the president of some countries, the presidents, sometimes they don't belong to what they personally believe sometimes. That's why you said if you were a president of the United States that you probably would not talk like this. And that's why you didn't have any chance to become a president, because your choice was different always. And you're absolutely right about the loved ones in the Ukraine. My father, my aunt, my cousin, one of my cousins, they survived the Mariupol siege, the battles from Mariupol, and for more than a month we didn't have any idea whether they're alive or not. I did have a couple of around 20 friends in Mariupol. I'm sorry, it's not really easy to talk about that. And all of them came out, could make it alive. And that was horrible, actually. But this is not what we're talking about. I was just agreeing with you. I'm sorry for my...
No. We're having a conversation. This is
yeah, exactly. Thank you for that. It's really, it's much easier to have conversation with you because it feels informal. It feels just like a talk of two people just met in the airport and discussing where to go, where you going, where I go, and what's good in the place where I live in, etc. It's just great. Well, okay, I can't spend too much of your time, so let's just start with the questions. Just recently, Sergei Lavrov, the foreign minister of Russia, visited South African Republic, where he said that the proxy war between the West and Russia in Ukraine is no longer a proxy. It becomes more and more likely a real war. So what we can make out of this? How should we figure that? So are we pedaling to the Third World War III already, or it's just a message which Sergei Lavrov is trying to send to the West that,
Well, I mean, let's start with just, again, first principles. I think the United States and NATO understands the consequences of a direct conflict with Russia. Regardless of how it turns out in terms of conventional force, there is a real risk that it would escalate to nuclear conflict, and there's no such thing as a limited nuclear war.
Absolutely.
So the moment a single nuclear weapon is used, it will eventually escalate to a general thermonuclear exchange and the end of all life on Earth as we know it.
Yeah.
And as long as that remains in the back of everybody's mind, we're okay. And what I mean by that is, I don't think we're going to head down that path. But it's a very, very dangerous game that the United States and NATO are playing. And it's a game that has been encouraged somewhat by the absolute maturity of the Russian government. And what I mean by that is, Russia has from the very beginning done a masterful job of escalation management. Making sure that its actions aren't of such a precipitous nature as to provoke a NATO intervention. And so where Russia could have acted in a more aggressive fashion, they didn't. I'm not privy to the thinking that went into the initial phase of the Russian special military operation. But I take President Putin at face value when he said this wasn't a war, this was a special military operation. Even Arestovich, and I know I don't like to put too much emphasis on his words because he's a propagandist of the highest order. But now that he's now that he's a private citizen, he's given some very interesting interviews. Mm-hmm. And one of the things that he said was that the Russians came in gently, not trying to kill, not trying to occupy, believing that there would be limited resistance, and I think there was two things. One, of course, President Putin said that is because they view the Ukrainian people as their brothers, and that you don't want to come in hard against your brothers. But the other thing is, and I respect President Putin, and I believe that he believes what he said. But I also know that, or strongly believe that the Russian generals are saying, no, boss, it's going hard. Let's get this thing done. Let's do it right. Let's crush them. Let's get it over with. And Putin, I believe, said no, because if we go in hard, like you ask, like you suggest, we may provoke NATO intervention. By going in so hard, we may panic NATO and prompt them to intervene. So I believe that one of the aspects of the special military operation was to go in so softly that even NATO would go, whoa, we don't understand what's going on. Maybe this isn't as dangerous as we thought it was. We're just going to wait. And they did. Now, the mistake in that is that NATO didn't believe that Russia, I didn't believe it. I have to tell you the truth. I thought, wow, why are they doing this? And literally putting one hand behind their back, going in. This is amazing. This is unbelievable. I thought they would come in using doctrine and crush and destroy and what war is all about, what we would have done if we were the United States, if this was the United States. And they didn't. But I know that Russia is militarily stronger than what they projected when they went in initially. I know there's strength there in the Russian system, but it also confused me that they went in with a peacetime military composition, peacetime. There was no mobilization, there was nothing. There was just a peacetime complement of soldiers going in. And in my mind, I said it from the beginning, even if they're successful, they don't have enough troops because the distances they're talking about occupying are vast, and you need troops sufficient to the task of occupying. If there's any resistance, there's going to be a problem. And there wasn't just a little bit of resistance, there was massive resistance. And the Russians didn't have enough troops. And this was misread by NATO as a sign of Russian weakness. And that was, I think, one of the fatal mistakes that NATO has made, because Russia was seeking to manage this problem, and NATO sought to overreact. And that's where, and the other thing I can say is, was phase one a failure? I mean, there's another big question that history is going to have to answer. What was the objective of phase one? Was it the total defeat of Ukraine? I believe that there was some hope that resistance would collapse and that the Russians would. But I also think the Russians were realistic, because almost immediately Russia began entertaining negotiations. And if I've learned anything from negotiating with Russians, they don't like to negotiate from a position of strength, or from weakness, I'm sorry. They don't like to negotiate with great uncertainty. When they come to the table, they have well-defined objectives. I learned a lot from my Russian foreign ministry counterparts, and they aren't amateurs. They're not people who panic. They come in and they know what they want to accomplish and how they want to accomplish it. So when they started meeting with the Ukrainians early on in the conflict, before the military had achieved a victory, it led me to believe that total military victory wasn't the objective. The objective was to go in hard and then accept a negotiation that would be a compromise in the middle. And that played out. You saw in Istanbul, they were ready. And Lavrov has spoken about this. They were ready to have a peace settlement that would keep Zelensky in power, keep the Ukrainian military intact. It would just require NATO to leave Ukraine. It would require Ukraine not to become a member of NATO. Donbass would, of course, retain its independence. Independence, not being part of Russia. Independence. And Crimea, of course, be Russia. And it looked like Ukraine was at least pretending to be part of this. But what we now know is that NATO wouldn't allow this to happen. Boris Johnson came in and gave the big nix. But now we have indications from the head of Ukrainian intelligence that the negotiations were just a sham to buy time. part of the whole overall process of taking advantage of Russia's desire for a peaceful resolution. Because remember, the Minsk Accords, Russia bought in for the Minsk Accords from day one. Vladimir Putin said it was one of his greatest mistakes was to believe the West. He finished the problem in 2014, but he believed the West when they said they wanted peace. We now know they didn't want peace. They were just buying time to build up this military. And now the peace negotiations with Ukraine were a sham also, to buy time. But the West took Russia's position as a sign of weakness. And that's why they started, what the United States calls the New Lend-Lease Act of $45 billion, which has now become over $106 billion, worth of $106 billion.
Yeah.
Imagine that.
No one knows where they went exactly.
But we know that a lot of it went into equipment that ended up in the Ukrainian military that was reinvigorated because the Russians had largely destroyed the Ukrainian military by June, July. But suddenly this new army shows up that launches an aggressive attack against Russians who are overextended. Because when you have 200,000 troops, not all 200,000 are on the front lines. A lot of them are in the rear. You might have 80,000 on the front lines. And when you have a frontage of over 1,000 kilometers, that means you're looking at 50, 60 men per kilometer. You can't defend a kilometer of territory with 50 or 60 men. And when the Ukrainians massed 20, 30, 40,000 troops together, they were able to punch through. There was no defense in depth. And it was a disaster for the Russians. Now, the Russians handled it professionally. They didn't panic. They preserved the lives of their men, the most precious resource they have, and consolidated their defenses. Meanwhile, Ukraine lost men, equipment, and they continue to do that to this day. But it was a perception of Russian weakness that prompted this. Now we have a situation where Russia has recognized the error of its ways. They've mobilized 300,000 reservists. On top of that, there's a considerable number of volunteers that have also been brought in. I would estimate over 100,000. And then you have the troops that were there to begin with. I think Russia has between 600 and 700,000 troops coming into play. But these troops are different. To give you an example, when the Russians entered this special military operation initially, they were using a operational methodology that was derived from the end of the Cold War, where Russia downsized its army and went away from division, regiment, battalion, and they created something called the Battalion Tactical Group. And that became their primary tactical unit. And so people didn't speak of which regiment, which brigade, et cetera. They said, how many battalion tactical groups is Russia employing? There's indication now that Russia's not using the battalion tactical group right now, that they've gone back to original first principles, that they're attacking using doctrine that dates back to Soviet times, where you have divisional fire support and you have regiments and battalions operating on a larger front, the kind of frontages that battalion tactical groups are. This means Russia's going to war. I know politically Russia hasn't committed to that. They still call it a special military operation. But I'm calling it a war because Russia now, I believe, has changed its mindset. And when the Russian offensive starts, and there's some indication that it's beginning at the early stages, this is going to be a kind of war totally different from what occurred in phase 1, phase 2, and even over the summer and the fall. This is going to be as close to total war as one can get. It's going to be tragic because the amount of death and destruction that's going to take place on both sides. Because war it's a knife that cuts both ways.
Yeah.
But Russia is going to win. But here's the key. Can Russia achieve victory? Because if Russia wins too quickly, I don't know where Russia's going to go. I have ideas. I've looked at a map. I have Russian history. But if Russia, for instance, makes a move to Odessa and stalls, is NATO, Romania, et cetera, going to feel the need to fill the vacuum in southern Ukraine to prevent the total collapse of the Ukraine front? So how does Russia achieve its objective? I believe a logical objective would be to remove the Transnistria problem by extending Russian control through Odessa, link up, and now you have no more worries about the isolation of Transnistria. It is now part of the whole. Again, I'm not a Russian strategist. I don't know what Russia's thinking. I'm just saying if that's the case, how do you achieve that without causing NATO to panic and intervene? How do you, likewise, operate in the north? I think Kharkov is ripe for the taking. I think Petrovsk might be. But how do you do this in a manner that prevents the West from panicking? So how does Russia win decisively without panic? And I believe that this is calculated into the Russian thinking because they have been masters of escalation management, whereas the West isn't. Look, the West has violated every red line Russia's put out there. The bottom line is this. If you just listen to General Mark Meilers, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, who just visited the Grafenwold training facility in Germany, he's openly saying that we are training Ukrainian forces to be us, to be us. We're training them in the same methodology of combat that I was trained in, combined arms operations, close integration of armor, armored fighting vehicles, artillery, air, how to bring that together in a culmination of power to achieve a military objective.
I'm sorry.
That means Russia's at war with NATO.
To be us, what do you mean to be us? You just said...
yes, to be America. To be America.
To be us. To be us, yes.
Yeah, to be us, to be Americans, to fight like us.
Mm-hmm.
Which means that when this force is stood up and goes into Ukraine, Russia's fighting the United States. Because at the end of the day, a man is a man. Okay, he's a piece of meat.
Yeah.
Blood. But how the man is organized, equipped, and how he operates is the definition. We see this over and over again where, look, in the Marine Corps, I love the Marine Corps. We have a large amount of immigrants who join the Marines because they're proud of being an American. They want to serve their country. All right? So they're not red-blooded Americans raised in the South and all this. They're foreigners who come to the United States, have limited exposure to the United States, but when we put them through the Marine Corps training process, they become Marines, they become warriors. It doesn't matter that they're Mexican, Puerto Rican, African, Asian, doesn't matter. They're Marines. And what I'm trying to say here is that the Ukrainians that are going through Grafenwold right now are being turned into American fighters. They're thinking like Americans, they're going to act like Americans, they're going to operate like Americans, which means when they go back to Ukraine, Russia's going to be fighting Americans. And this is a big deal. This is a big deal for the United States because, one, if Russia beats us, and I think Russia will beat these troops, that's got to be a wake-up call for NATO and the United States that we might have to take a look at what we're doing and how we're doing it. But two, it also, the defeat of this force may cause NATO to say, well, we can't use the Ukrainian proxy anymore. We're going to bring the real deal in. Rather than having a brigade that's organized, trained to look like us, act like us, operate like us, we're going to bring in the 2nd Brigade of the 2nd Armored Division. We're going to bring in, the real force and do this.
American force on the ground.
Yeah, that's the problem. That's the danger of escalation. Right now, sane minds say, no, we're not going to do that. But what happens when you have Lloyd Austin say that we are going to punish Russia? We're going to take it to the Russians. We're going to confront Russia. This is extraordinarily aggressive rhetoric, which attaches to it some political liability, which means once you commit to this, if you don't deliver, you have a political problem. And remember, 2024 is a presidential election, and Joe Biden claims that he wants to be running for re-election. And he doesn't want to be running for re-election as the president who got his rear end kicked in Ukraine. So this is where insanity can come into play. And this is where the maturity of Russia comes into play. Look, the Russians have been calling this out from day one. They've been saying this is very dangerous. This is, the escalation is dangerous. These are red lines that you're crossing. But the United States and NATO continue to cross them. Now, I have to say that if the United States was in the same position as Russia, let me reverse now for a second and say that the United States is fighting a Russian incursion into Mexico. But the Russian troops aren't there. They're just training Cubans and Nicaraguans to come into Mexico and fight into Mexico. I can promise you that if you were using Guatemala or Honduras as a base to receive Russian equipment to train insurgents to go into Mexico, we would bomb Guatemala and Honduras. So if the United States was Russia and people were bringing equipment into Poland, Poland would be bombed because Poland is an active participant in the conflict. Germany, by hosting these conferences where this is discussed, has become an active participant in the conflict. Any nation providing material support to Ukraine is an active participant in the conflict. And Russia has every legal right to engage them militarily to defeat them. The laws of preemption, you don't have to wait for somebody to come and punch you in the face. If it looks like they're getting ready to punch you, bam, you get to hit them first. It's called preemptive self-defense. And yet Russia's not doing it. Why? Because Russia knows the consequences, the potential consequences. And I also think that Russia is so confident in its victory, that it's willing to allow all of these things to occur, even though it disadvantages. And here's the tragic part. This is the part that just breaks my heart. It breaks my heart. The Russian leaders know that by not preempting, by allowing this to happen, thousands of Russian soldiers are going to die. And they do it anyways. Why? Because they are responsible for 150 million Russian people. And here, I mean, again, I'm going to get teary-eyed here, but the fact that these soldiers are going out there, because in the United States, we don't operate that way. I don't, as a Marine, I don't operate where I say, I'm willing to give the enemy an advantage and sacrifice my Marines if I'm going to war, I'm going to win. I'm winning at all costs. I'm going to kill everybody in front of me. There's just no way. That's why we're Marines. We are very aggressive, hyper-aggressive, and we slaughter everything. Not women and children, but anything that's in front of us. The Russians, I believe, are good soldiers. Very good soldiers. Your paratroopers, very good. Wagner, come on. The Marines and your average soldier, good soldiers. But they're being told, slow, not too fast, et cetera. Knowing, don't bomb this, don't bomb that. Knowing that when they make that decision, they're going to lose the men to their left and their right. They may die themselves. And they're doing it anyways. It breaks your heart. There's something called the burden of command. The burden of command. And it's amazing. Armchair warriors don't understand it because we all sit here in perfection and we draw arrows on maps and we say we would do this and we would do that, we would do this. But we don't have the responsibility. But when the responsibility falls on your shoulders, when you receive the list every morning of the dead soldiers, and you have to be the one signing the letters that go out to the families.
I mean, I didn't forget to press record. Okay.
Look, before we got cut off, I was just get carried on because it's an emotional topic. But my point is that this is a war between the collective West and Russia. There's no doubt about it. And if left to its own devices, it's a war that could very easily spin out of control and become a direct conflict between the United States, NATO, and Russia. But I'm less fearful of this because I believe in the maturity of the Russian government and the wise decisions they have made when it comes to escalation management. But I hope the Russian people understand, because it's very easy to criticize military and government officials when casualties start to occur. And there's all of these armchair quarterbacks, we call them in the United States, armchair generals, who say, I could do this different. And you see the blogs. There's a lot of people, I'm not going to give them airtime, but there's a lot of people who participated in the conflict from 2014 to 2022 in the Donbass on the side of the pro-Russian, the ethnic Russian, and they're very bitter, I guess, for not being given the status they feel they believe, and they're very critical of Russian leadership, of Russian military, et cetera. And look, no one says Russian leadership is perfect. No one says the military is perfect. Nothing's perfect. We're all human. But the decisions that the Russian leadership are making are decisions that are the hardest in the world for anybody to make. And I think they're doing the right thing. They're thinking strategically. They're thinking in terms of everything that's happening. They're also thinking about what needs to happen once this conflict is done. The Russians are preparing for what happens after the war. And a lot of armchair generals don't. They want the quick victory. They want this. They want this. But they don't have the burden of command. The burden of command is a huge burden. And the Russian people, I hope, will show the same level of maturity as their government and understand that many of these decisions that are made, they're difficult decisions, but they have to be made because you don't want this thing to spiral out of control. You don't want this to become a nuclear war. Because I believe in my heart of hearts that Russians love their children as much as I love my children. Russian grandparents love their grandchildren as much as, if I'm ever blessed with grandchildren, I would love mine. And you want a better world for them, and a world that is going to be subjected to the Holocaust of nuclear conflict will not be a better world. It won't exist. And so people need to keep that in mind. It's the Russian government, more than any other government in the world today, that's preventing this situation from escalating to a potential nuclear conflict.
It's not only, well, it's difficult not only to wage the war, but to get on the leash your enemy, not to get off that leash. I mean, you see what I mean? This is maybe this burden is just double.
It's huge. Look, Sergei Lavrov, I've known him and known of him since he was the Russian ambassador to the United Nations back when I was a weapons inspector. And he's a man who is always deserves respect, even if you disagree with him. He deserves respect because he doesn't speak idly. His words are very well thought out. But this isn't just his ability to master, clever rhetoric. There's some thought behind everything he says and everything he does. And if and when, because I hope it's when, this war ends, and I believe it's going to end in a manner which is favorable to Russia. He's not going to get it, but he deserves the Nobel Peace Prize. He and Vladimir Putin deserve the Nobel Peace Prize. And they're going to say, well, how can you give him the Peace Prize for going to war? Well, because they prevented this war from going nuclear. And remember, they didn't start this war. This war was thrust upon. So I think he won't get it. Just like I've always said, I'm proud of my Canadian friends, and I'm proud of the Canadian Armed Forces, and I know they got the Nobel Peace Prize for their participation in United Nations peacekeeping operations. But I always felt that the Russian military police, for what they did in Syria, was worthy of recognition of a Nobel Peace Prize, because how they managed this horrible conflict and tried to lead it out of the kind of violence and create the potential for a peaceful outcome at great risk to themselves. They don't get any credit for that here in the West. We just say, oh, they're Russians, they're warmongers, they're this, that. But anybody who digs deep to it, you realize, the heroism and the sacrifice and the discipline and the dedication that's involved in what they do. But here in the West, we're not allowed to say that about Russians, you see, because you guys are evil. You're the personification of all that's wrong in the world. And of course, you're brainless robots who only listen to the instructions of your all-powerful, all-seeing dictator, Vladimir Putin, because that's what we're led to believe here in the West. But the reality is so much different. Anyways, sorry, I'm babbling again.
No. It's very familiar. Well, I'm a Soviet boy who used to know that we are in the Soviet Union, just a gray mass sitting on the tanks, waiting for the command to go on offensive, dressed like 60 years before during the Second World War and so on and so forth, just like that. So it's absolutely familiar, and which is very odd that this still works. This narration is still working, in the West, and very many people believe that. Okay, So here comes the funny part. I just read the headline in Vesti news outlet, which was citing the Reuters. I didn't find right on the fly the headline in Reuters, but I do believe it was there because I don't think that Vesti would make it up. So the headline was like this. The United States asked Ukraine not to go on offensive before the weapon arrives. So, which makes me think, with which army? Army of clones, or maybe army of clowns, for that matter? What is this? Ukraine going on offensive. This sounds like a joke, very sick and very cruel joke. Because it reminds me of a very one of our most favorite Soviet jokes when I was a kid. That let's say the chairman of the General Chiefs of Staff in the United States in Reagan time convenes the high-ranking officers and says, "Okay, we can oppose. We're able to oppose Russian airborne with our Marines. Okay, we have our Navy to oppose Russian Navy, but we don't have anything to oppose Russian construction battalions. Do you know of Russian construction battalions? Yeah, so you are familiar with the concept." And he was asked, "Why?" And the answer was, "Those beasts are so fierce, they are not even given the weapons, just digging tools."
Yeah.
So my question is, have Ukrainians become so fierce, so they in minuscule numbers and without weapons are gonna go on offensive, or they got the army of clones or clowns? I'm sorry for putting it that way.
No, it's a fair question. I'll just say my experience with Construction Battalion is direct. They built the facility that we worked with outside of the Votkinsk missile final assembly plant. We put in an inspection facility together with the housing.
Mm-hmm.
It was a Soviet construction battalion that did that, and so we worked with them on a daily basis. So I know them very well.
Okay.
Very hard workers and no weapons. But
Yeah.
let's put it this way: when the United States intervened in May with the $45 billion injection of military assistance and financial aid, the end result was that Ukraine was able to resurrect or regenerate around 70,000 troops that they were able to hold back from the battlefield through new mobilization, etc. And those troops were used in September to recapture Kharkiv, or Kharkiv. I guess to the victor goes the way you pronounce it. So until Russia takes it back, but that's a joke, a bad joke. Or in the right bank of Kherson. But a lot of people don't understand why that was. I mean, if you take a look at the battle in the Kharkov area, there were what the Russians call OMON or Sber, basically police SWAT units from different cities that were on the front lines. Police SWAT units. I mean, they're good at going in and taking out criminals and terrorists, but they're on the front line. Doctrinally, it should be a mechanized rifle battalion dug in with artillery fire support. Instead, you have police SWAT units with no artillery fire support. Nobody covering it. 5 kilometers between their positions with no artillery and nothing. 40 kilometers deep, nothing behind them.
Yeah.
So the Ukrainians were able to penetrate the lines and compel the withdrawal. The Ukrainians got this artificial sense of accomplishment. So did the West. Aha, look, we brought these forces in and they took all this territory. Well, they took it because the Russians couldn't defend it because they didn't have enough manpower. The same thing when you go down to Kherson. The Russians had the manpower, 30,000 men there, but logistically it was impossible to supply because of the HIMARS and the artillery fires. And if Russia decided to defend it, they were going to lose 10, 15% of this 30,000 men. And the Russian command said, why are we going to sacrifice 3,000 to 5,000 Russian soldiers for a piece of terrain that's indefensible? Why don't we pull back and wait till we regroup and we'll eventually recapture? But from the Ukrainian, the American side, they're like, look, all this territory they captured, they're very good. Now, the Ukrainians have burned through these routes. They don't exist anymore. They've been burned through. There's nothing left. But the feeling now is that by providing Ukraine with this new equipment, they're going to rebuild, reconstitute a strike force capable of achieving the same result. And we know this because General Zaluzhny, the commander of the Ukrainian forces, gave an interview to The Economist. The interview is notable in several ways. One, he said, if we don't get this assistance, we've lost. Now, Ukraine's never admitted that. But he said, we're losing tremendous amount of troops. The casualties are extraordinarily high. And if we don't get the assistance, the outcome is known to all, which is the size of Russian victory. But then he says, I can beat these guys. I can beat them. But what I need is 300 tanks, 500 infantry fighting vehicles, 500 artillery pieces. That's the equivalent of, say, 6 brigades of troops, 6 brigades, all right? And, you know, that again, will probably be around 50, 60,000 troops. Some are already ongoing training, and the Ukraine's in the process of, a new mobilization that's going to put more troops in. So they've got the equipment and they're going to have the manpower. So these aren't clones or clowns. This is real. Except they don't have the equipment. You see, he said he needed 6 brigades to do what? To advance 84 kilometers to take the city of Melitopol, which would sever the land bridge between Russia and Crimea and allow the Ukrainians from that position to bring effective onto the Crimea Isthmus, breaking the Russian will and eventually leading to a coup. So the Ukrainians have a plan. They have a plan. They believe that they can replicate what happened in Kharkov or Kherson. They believe that they're going to be able to advance 84 kilometers, seize the city of Melitopol, build a corridor, and then threaten Crimea and roll up of the Donbass. The problem is, one, there's no more Oman battalions on the front line. There's not even, I think there was another, BARS is another thing, the volunteer regiment. So they fought heroically in the Battle of Limon. But again, they were isolated. Because at that time, the Russians one of the big mistakes the Russians made was they didn't thoroughly integrate the Russian army with the forces fighting in Donetsk and Lugansk. And so what would happen is the Russian army would have artillery fire support, but the special forces or the police units or the BARS units, the volunteer units, didn't have dedicated artillery and they weren't coordinated effectively with the Russian military. So the Ukrainians were able to exploit the gaps where it should have been a fire kettle or cauldron where they would get trapped and hit by artillery. There was no artillery. They just pushed through. The Ukrainians believe they can do this again. This is their mistake because the Russians now have a defensive line that is doctrinally set out. There's not BARS units, and if there is a BARS unit, it's co-located with a mechanized rifle battalion. They have armored battalions in reserve, dedicated. They're not going to be sent anywhere else, and there's sufficient artillery to break up the attack before it comes in, and if they penetrate into secondary and tertiary lines of defense, because the Russians have built defense in depth, they'll be isolated and annihilated. This is the reality. So even if Zaluzhny was to get his 6 brigades, and even if somehow he could bring those brigades from the border with Poland to the front line without being severely interdicted by Russia, but the Russians have reallocated General Armageddon, General Surovikin, to the head of the air campaign, which is a dedicated standalone component now of the next Russian phase, which means I would happen to believe that he understands the importance of interdiction and that he's going to have a plan in place to attract as much of this power before it gets to the front line. Let's just say, from a miracle, that Zaluzhny gets all 6 brigades and he launches the attack. They will be destroyed. They cannot win. They cannot break through. It'll be bloody for the Russians. but he doesn't get 6 brigades. He needed 500 infantry fighting vehicles. He got 290. And these are infantry fighting vehicles out of the same kind. There's 59 Bradleys, there's 40 Martyrs, there's 54 CV-90s, there's 90 Strykers. But the Bradleys they're getting aren't the frontline Bradleys that we use in America. They're getting the ones that we don't use anymore. The one thing about the Bradley is it's a maintenance nightmare. If you look at it, it breaks. And so we're giving them 59 maintenance nightmares. Now, we happen to have in the United States mechanics who are trained to deal with this nightmare. And we have spare parts and we have the ability to pull a broken track back, put in a new engine and move on. Ukraine will not have this. So I believe even if all their Bradleys get to the front line, when they start an attack, that most of them are just going to break down.
So what you are saying, that Bradley, even for American technician, is no picnic to maintain, even on American territory. Or, let's say, more than that, on the battlefield away from the United States, let's say in Iraq, that was a nightmare to maintain, because you are in...
But even in Iraq, we deployed our maintenance capability into Iraq. So even in Iraq, we could come in, recover the Bradley, and we had the ability to repair it there. And if we didn't, we put it on a ship and send it back to the United States. But in Iraq, we were fighting insurgents. We weren't fighting a mechanized army. So when we lost a Bradley to maintenance issues, we could recover it. But in a mechanized war with fluidity, if you lose a Bradley, the enemy advances and they recover. So, the Stryker, we're giving them 90 old Strykers, not the new Strykers, old Strykers. One of the things about Stryker is something called the Height Maintenance System, HMS. So what it does is the Stryker, when it goes through muddy terrain, you can raise the Stryker so it can clear bad terrain. You can also deal with for maintenance, but it's a very sophisticated suspension system, air suspension system, very complicated. And if you don't constantly maintain it, I mean constantly maintain it, the system comes down on the wheels and it flattens all the tires. Now, again, for the Americans, one, we train all our guys. I mean, if you take a look at what the additional training has to take place just to make sure the HMS system functions, it's constant maintenance, constant evaluation, lots of spare parts involved. Now you're in combat, you're a Ukrainian soldier. You've received this. They told you about the HMS, but now you're moving into combat. You're not maintaining it. You don't know how to maintain it. You don't know all the things that have to be done. And all of a sudden it comes down to start right, pop, pop, you lose 2 tires. Pop, pop, you lose 2 more. Now you're sitting down. Bam, you're dead. There's 90 coffins that we just gave you.
Just to make clear, what vehicle exactly you were saying right now? I mean, the Stryker and I just...
The United States is providing 59 Bradleys, M2 Bradleys.
Yeah.
And 90 Strykers, which are a 8-wheel vehicle. We call it a combat carrier. It's not designed to function as an infantry fighting vehicle because of its armor and stuff. But it's, the bottom line is it will be employed by the Ukrainians as an infantry combat vehicle. It'll be brought to the front line. It has, weaponry that will be brought to bear. But again, maintenance-wise, it'll just break. I don't think the Ukrainians will have any of these things functioning after a month.
No, I get it.
The Martyr is also very difficult to maintain from the German perspective, and they're not getting the new ones. They're getting the old ones. I don't know too much about the CV-90, the Swedish gear, but I did used to own a Saab. And while it functioned great when it needed to be maintained, it wasn't easy to maintain.
Wait a second. Look, I used to be trained as an officer. And even me right now, already, Martyr, Stryker, Bradley, what else? Swedish? Yeah. Okay. All of this, I gotta learn how to maintain.
Yes.
For all this shit, I'm sorry to say that.
Yeah.
I have to figure out how to get the parts, different fuel, probably different fuel.
No, they're all diesel. I
okay.
They're all diesel.
Okay. But anyways, the fuel has to be brought on the line.
Yeah.
And I have to get probably different teams to maintain all of them, because to train one team to maintain all of them, well, it's maybe easier to get help from God to do that than to have one team trained to maintain all of those.
Right.
Yeah.
It's a nightmare. Now we go to the artillery.
Sounds like fun.
290 vehicles, 4 different kinds of vehicles, impossible to maintain. So we've done the Ukrainians no favors there. But we didn't give them enough. They don't have enough vehicles. They asked for 500, they got 290. They asked for 500 artillery pieces. We gave them, according to what's going on, the United States are providing the M109 Paladin, 155 millimeter self-propelled thing. I used to be in a M109 battalion.
I'm sorry, please say it again. Which is?
It's an M109. It's a
M109.
It's a self-propelled 155 millimeter artillery piece. I'm not going to call it a maintenance nightmare, but it's a maintenance nightmare, meaning you have to maintain it. It's very difficult to maintain. The Swedes are giving them their, I think what they call the Archer system, or the Danes are giving them the Archer system, which is a wheeled vehicle. But again, it's a lightweight. Anytime you create lightweight artillery, it's because you're removing maybe aluminum or steel parts and replacing with titanium. Titanium cracks. The one thing about the way the West has designed artillery is that we don't employ it the way the Soviets or the Russians do. We do limited precision strike fires. We do some massed fires, but not sustained mass fires. During Desert Storm, which I fought in, we fired 60,000 artillery rounds for the entire conflict. The Russians are firing 60,000 rounds a day. That shows you the scale and scope and scale. And so these artillery pieces, for instance, the M777, which the United States provided the towed howitzer, the Ukrainians are bringing it in, they started firing it, and they're firing it at sustained rates it wasn't designed to, and everything's breaking, it's cracking, the nitrogen's leaking, they can't maintain it. So even if the Russians don't kill it, it breaks, it has to be taken out of the country, it's no good to anybody. Every single piece of artillery that's been supplied to them is very maintenance intensive. And is not designed to fire at the sustained rates that are required for this kind of combat. So they're all going to break automatically. That's just reality. But the thing is, Ukraine asked for 500 of them. And I think the total numbers that are being given are 100, 120, maybe 150. So it's not enough. But here comes the kicker: tanks. Ukraine said they needed 300 tanks. Mm-hmm. They got 14 Challenger 2s. Again, the Challenger 2 may have been a good tank at one time, but I can guarantee you they're not getting the frontline pieces off the bridge. They're getting the ones that were in storage, and they're going to be turned over. And they may now, there's a lot of debate now about, can the Leopards that the Germans produce, can other people provide them? There's some talk that Poland's going to provide 14. That's 28. That's less than 10% of what Ukraine asked for. But here's the final thing. First of all, we understand, even if all the equipment works perfectly, Ukraine's getting far less than what they requested. All the equipment doesn't work perfectly. The training requirements are out of this world. You know, you're a military officer, you know about training, the complexity involved in training all these people. And it's not just that, you have to get all these things to work together in unison for combined arms operation, which is another level of nightmare. But here's the real killer. They are being committed on different schedules. For instance, some of the pieces that are being brought out have to be brought up, maintained. They won't be available until May, June. Other pieces may be available now, but the training requirement is weeks long. So my point is that the Ukrainians are going to be receiving this equipment in a staggered fashion, along with the troops. And what the United States is saying is, you have to wait until you get all of it together, so you can have this fist. But understand, Ukraine needed 2 fists, and we're giving them 2 fingers. They don't even have 1 fist. We're going to give them 2 fingers. But even with the 2 fingers, in order to poke Russia in the eye, you need it all to be together. It's not going to happen. And here's what's going to happen, I believe.
So instead of beating like this, they're going to do this.
Bink, and all Russia has to do is
I'm sorry. This is funny anyway, and it's tragic, actually, absolutely tragic.
What we're doing is condemning tens of thousands of Ukrainian soldiers to die, because we're giving them bad equipment, we're not giving them the right equipment, it's insufficient equipment, difficult to maintain equipment, and we're giving it in a way that it's going to be the temptation for Ukraine. And we saw this. The initial tranche of money that we gave allowed Ukraine to build 2 corps, armored corps, mechanized corps. The first one was committed in the fighting, and it broke through. It got the Kharkov victory and all that. But they suffered horrific casualties. As the second corps was being assembled, rather than to consolidate it and do a single striking force to exploit these attacks, Ukraine had to send it in piecemeal. So as a battalion became available, it went in, battalion came in. So again, instead of the fist, they were putting it in a finger at a time. It's nothing. And they got burned up, etc.
Now they just have been poking the elephant from different sides with one finger.
Different sides. And they're all dying. The finger gets broken, that's it. Now as they receive this equipment, what the United States fears is going to happen is probably what's going to happen. See, Russia's launching an offensive, but I think it's going to be offensive on a broad front. And it's going to be a slow, grinding offensive that's going to put pressure throughout. It may be sequenced because the Russians aren't stupid. They understand you attack here, you cause reserves to be committed here. You attack here, they have to commit reserves. And as you do that, holes are going to open up and you attack. And now these forces are going to start flowing in. And the Ukrainians aren't going to be able to say, keep them in place, hold them. They're going to say, you fill that gap, you fill that gap. And so they're going to come in, they're going to get ground up. And all this army that we're building, that the United States is building for Ukraine and NATO's building, is just going to be burned up. And I think that's what's going to happen. So this is just a colossal propaganda ploy that's being played by the West, and it's going to fail. Look, this is the reality of military math. We can talk about 10-to-1 casualty ratios. Okay, that means that every 10 Ukrainians killed, 1 Russian is killed. And everybody goes, wow, that's pretty good. That's good for Russia. Okay, but I just talked about the potential of Ukraine losing 40,000 troops. If it's 10-to-1, that's 4,000. But I understand 10-to-1 can only be achieved if you're on the defensive. As soon as you go on the offensive, the odds change because you're taking more risks, you're opening yourself, you're more vulnerable. So the kill ratio drops to maybe 6-to-1, 5-to-1, 4-to-1, depending on the intensity of the combat.
Which means a lot.
A lot. So if it's 40,000...
10-to-1, even 10-to-1 is a lot already.
And what I tell people...
On the scale of this conflict.
During the Vietnam War, the height of the Vietnam War, America was losing 200, 250 men a week. And that broke the soul of America. We were politically unable to sustain this conflict because of the casualty levels. If, let's say, the current, casualty, people are talking 800, 1,000 Ukrainians a day right now being ground up in the meat grinder. So let's talk 10-to-1. Let's say 800 Ukrainians. That's 80 Russians a day. 7 days a week, that's 540 dead Russians a week. That's twice what America suffered in Vietnam, and it broke our spirit. Russia right now is suffering twice the level of casualties that America suffered in Vietnam, and yet they're continuing to go. And this is what the American people need to understand. We keep thinking that we can somehow turn this war into a political liability for Vladimir Putin, that we can somehow create the conditions for a Moscow Maidan, where the Russian people will rise up and move in. The Russian people are absorbing casualty rates that are twice the number that we suffered in Vietnam, and they're not quitting. They're there. They're behind them. They're moving. We don't understand the Russian people. We don't understand their capacity to suffer. And I'm not saying that it's a good thing, but when you're a nation that suffered 27 million people fighting fascism in World War II, you can take 540 casualties. It's not easy. It's not easy. Anybody who thinks it's easy, ask the Russian mother, ask the Russian wife, ask the Russian daughter and son who lost their loved ones over there. It ain't easy, but they're going to do it. And that's what we don't understand. We don't understand that Russia is committed to this fight. And, God, it just breaks my heart because this war didn't need to happen. And now that it's happening, we're just doing things that are prolonging the suffering of both the Ukrainians and the Russians. To what end? To what end? Because we have a bunch of ignorant people like Michael McFaul and Fiona Hill and others who are painting artificial picture of Russia where we ignore the nation, we ignore the people, we ignore the history, we ignore the culture, and we focus on one man, Vladimir Putin, and we don't even get that right. I mean, we don't even know how to explain Vladimir Putin. We forget about the decade of the 1990s and Boris Yeltsin and what we did to use Yeltsin as a tool to destroy Russia. We forget that Vladimir Putin came into power to reverse that trend, and that what Vladimir Putin is guilty of is making Russia great again. That's his biggest sin. He forgot he's not supposed to do that. He forgot he's supposed to bend to the will of America. He forgot he's supposed to be a compliant tool. He forgot he's supposed to be Boris Yeltsin too. Instead, he was Vladimir Putin, the Russian president, and he's brought Russia back. And again, I'm not pretending that he's perfect, but I understand that any fault that he has is primarily because of the circumstances that exist where the United States and others have been strangling Russia from day one. Strangling Russia. We've never been your friend. We've never been. There's a period of time when I was a weapons inspector at the end of the Soviet Union where we were friendly. We respected you, we feared you, and we were willing to work with you together to achieve a common objective. But then the Soviet Union collapsed and the fear went away. And when the fear went away because we didn't understand who you were, we exploited you, we dominated you, we sought to oppress you. And that's just a statement of fact. And Vladimir Putin stood up, and I personally believe that he saved Russia. And if the average Russian, and I know there's people out there, I have Russian friends, who say, well, you know, freedom of speech and all this stuff. I said, guys, it's hard to talk about freedom of speech when you have the entire Western world trying to strangle you to death. You know, how do you have freedom of speech with a hand around your throat? Stop talking about freedom of speech and start understanding what he did. He saved your country. He saved your country. And thank God he did.
Exactly.
Because without it, who knows where the world would be. Sorry, I ran.
Major, I can never thank you enough for being my guest today and for putting it in such a understandable and genuine way. That's why not only Russians, but a lot of people from Uzbekistan, Kazakhstan writing a lot of warm words in comments. They just love you. Yes, those people are from the territories which formerly have been the territories of the Soviet Union, and they consider themselves the part of one whole nation still. But anyway, I think the same comments would appear if you told like this, and I'm sure you would, about Guatemala, well, Rwanda, and any country in place of Russia. And I'm so grateful for that. And all of the people who's gonna watch you, I'm sure will be grateful to you. So thank you for being my guest, and I sincerely hope that maybe you will find some part of your time to be my guest again, because this is priceless, and I mean it.
Well, thank you very much. Like I said, it's been an honor and privilege to be able to have a conversation with you, and I would gladly come back on in a time and place of your choosing if you feel that a continued conversation would be of value.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.